Morning, so welcome. Uh, we're very pleased to have you with us today. Because this is a large group, we've got almost 100 people engaged in the webinar today. You will not be able to see each other's video or names, but we're really appreciative that you're all here. You should just be seeing my video and then later on my screen. So welcome. This is the first of these live events that we've done with Complex Trauma Resources, and we're excited to offer this today and to get into a discussion with you, hopefully on some, be able to touch on some things that you'll find helpful as you work with children in lots of different capacities around the province. It'd be really interesting to us to know where you're joining from. So maybe in the chat, if you would just wanted to throw in your city or town or wherever you're from, and I'd love to see who ends up being the furthest away that's joining us today. So I want to start off just with a bit of an introduction. My name is Dr. Chuck Geddes. I'm the founder and clinical director of Complex Trauma Resources. I live in Chilliwack, British Columbia. I'm married. I've got 3 adult sons, 2 of whom have flown the coop, and 1 who has some disabilities that still lives with us. We also have my parents living with us, and we're a household with 1 dog and 1 cat as well. I want to say that I'm appreciative of living and working and just enjoying life on the ancestral lands of the Stolo people, the people of the river, here in Chilliwack. Behind the scenes today, we've got from our Complex Trauma Resources team, we've got Nicole and Renee, who've been working very hard to communicate with you and put this offer out. And one of the things that they did is that they were asking you to submit questions. And so what we've done with that is we've kind of looked through that and pooled together the questions that made sense for today. And so we're going to be talking about calming the stress response, because I think that answers a lot of the questions that people have put forward. In terms of some housekeeping pieces, so I'll be presenting for about 30 minutes. And then after that, we'll have more in Q&A time. So you'll be able to enter in, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button, and it's possible for you to go there and to submit a question. Nicole and Renee will be kind of screening through those in the first half of the webinar today, and they'll highlight ones that they think have the sort of broadest appeal, broadest interest, and also that fit with the topic today about the stress response. We ask that as you share those, we ask that you don't put any personal information there. So if you're caring for a particular child, don't use their name, but we'd love to hear your questions. This is being recorded today, but no one's names or faces will show up in the recording. We had many more people express interest, almost double the number of people express interest that we're able to get into this call today. So we want to be able to have a recording available to them. So the other thing that we'll do at the end of the session today, so after the initial presentation and then the Q&A, and then what we'll do at the end is we'll share some resources for you through our Complex Trauma Resources site. We've got some exciting courses to tell you about, online courses as well. So we'll be talking about that and sharing a special offer at the end. Okay, today we want to be talking about calming the stress response, and particularly just sort of the idea that stress for the children that you care for, that we care for, that stress is the enemy. And so let me get this set up here. There we go. Okay, stress is the enemy for our kids. And in everything that we do, we talk about 2 therapeutic bookends to our healing and therapeutic process. And the first is to fight stress in all kinds of ways. So we have to deal with the stress response. And then beyond that, our second sort of pillar or part of our therapeutic bookends is to deepen attachment and provide healing around attachment injuries. We won't be able to talk about attachment today. We just have a short time, but we're going to touch on the calming the overreactive stress response. Now, in getting into this topic today, I know that some of you that have joined know tons about complex trauma already. I see Kim Hetherington on the call today who could be teaching this morning. I'm sure others know a lot, but I feel like we just need to sort of step back and review for just a minute. So we'll do that, and then we'll move into some specifics. So just generally, what's this idea of complex trauma and why is it important? What the research is telling us is that the experiences that we have as children affect our lives in profound ways. When we have an accumulation of experiences that are stressful and traumatic, it creates this kind of toxic stress environment that we live in. So it might be specific incidents in which we're harmed, neglected, abused, or it could be just kind of living in a situation where we have an overwhelming amount of stress, fearful about our attachments with adults, fearful that people will care for us, not knowing when people are going to respond to our needs, not knowing if we're going to have food, not knowing if we're going to be hurt, all of that kind of stressful environment, and even living in a situation where the adults around us, the other people around us, are fighting and hurting each other with words and physically. All of that creates this what we call complex trauma. There's another term for it, complex developmental trauma, because one of the key things about all of these experiences is that they end up creating kind of a cascade of problems in how our brain and our nervous systems develop. And this ends up setting up all kinds of issues for us in our development in all kinds of ways that 10 years ago I wouldn't have expected that these things were all kind of connected. In our CCI program, or under Complex Trauma Resources, we've looked at the research around the world about children coming out of those environments, and we've created what we call our 7 developmental domains. So what we know from the research and what we know now from 10 years of experience working with children and youth around BC with these challenges is that that effect of trauma shows up consistently and predictably in each one of these areas. Now, all children are going to be different, and all of their experiences are different, so they don't all have challenges in each one of these areas, but many of them do. And in fact, many of the children referred to our CCI program have profound sort of delays in each one of these areas in terms of how well they've been able to develop. So I'll just quickly run through these. So we've got an acronym for these 7 areas. No one eats apples in BC, to try and help us remember that. So we start kind of low down in the brain with the brain stem, with neurological and biological issues, the way that our brain integrates and organizes, the way that we manage sensory input, the way we can experience and sense what's going on within our body and what our physical needs are, physical coordination, all kinds of different things sort of fall underneath that category. Overreactive stress response is the second one we look at, and I'm going to dive into that a bit more, but our ability to manage stress and not get overwhelmed, not to move into a fight or flight or freeze response too quickly. Emotion regulation, as I'm going through this list, or as you're looking down this list, think about the children that you know and you work with. I would imagine that many of these issues you're going to see with them. So emotion regulation, trouble dealing with big feelings, maybe depressive kind of feelings, pessimism, not expecting things to go well, easily frustrated, easily overloaded with emotion. Attachment and relationships, difficulty forming relationships with adults, with peers, with main caregivers. Identity development. Who am I in the world? Where do I belong? Where do I fit? How do I feel about that? So many of our kids are their self-esteem is harmed, their sense of kind of mastery in the world is really low, they don't feel like there's anything they do well, and they often, coming out of these kind of traumatic situations we're talking about, the kids end up feeling like there's something wrong with me, inherently wrong with me, and that I'm not lovable. They have a deep sort of shame response. So that all comes under identity. And where do I belong? Where do I fit? What's my cultural connection? What's my family connection? What about community groups? Where do I fit? Where do I belong? And do I have value? That would all be under identity development. Behavior regulation is starting to talk about how do we use our thinking, because we're moving up in the brain here as we go from the first to the seventh here. We're actually moving up in the brain. We started the brain stem and then move up through into our limbic system and then up into our cortex, our thinking part of our brain. And we're saying that behavior regulation, how can I manage those impulses I have to do something? Do I have the ability to kind of slow down and think and make good decisions? So that's under behavior regulation. And then cognitive and language development, language, memory, processing information, all these kinds of things. So you may work with a child where, as I was running through that, or as you've learned about these 7 domains, where you actually can see that they struggle in every one of those areas. That would be typical for the children that we end up working with under the CCI program, Complex Care and Intervention Programs, or intervention program, or just generally in our consultation with schools or other areas. So we're going to focus in on this overreactive stress response piece. So a really kind of core part of this is something I try to keep this as simple as possible for us. So the idea that in the brain there's this organ called the amygdala, and this is part of the limbic system, but it sort of helps us to process. It has the brain to process threat. And it's called by Bessel van der Kolk, who's an international renowned trauma expert. He calls it the smoke alarm detector of the brain. And I really like that idea because the children that we work with have extremely sensitive smoke alarm systems that are going off in their brain, often regularly throughout the day, sometimes where they don't even quite notice it and where people around don't quite notice it. But you think about having a faulty smoke alarm in your house, and that if that was going off regularly throughout the day, or going off in that beep, beep, just sometimes kind of screaming at you. And our children walk through the days often with that happening kind of in the background. So they're trying to get through the day, but this threat detector keeps sounding. It's like it's so sensitive that even some little thing in their environment that they don't process with their thinking, that their body's reacting to it as that could be a threat. So it could be as small as someone's eyebrow raises. It could be that a door shuts down the hallway. It could be all of these things might be sort of setting off that little alarm within their head. And that's the amygdala that's responsible for that. So if we don't calm that down, what we end up with kids that are hyper aroused and hyper reactive. So we're getting children that are so easily, these are the kids we hear about that they go from, we're told they go from 0 to 60 and, just like that, and just so quickly get to a place where they're dysregulated, they're out of control emotionally and behaviorally, and they're not coping. And if we don't work hard to calm that down, then all the work that we might do around connecting with them and relationship and teaching and modeling and all these other good things that we try and do for them, if we don't quiet down that stress response, then it overwhelms all the other things that we're sort of putting into their lives. And so we feel like that stress response, again, that's one of our therapeutic bookends. It absolutely has to be the first thing that we're gonna target and target all the time. And it's I'll talk some more about some of the things that we try and do with that. So with the overactive stress response, the lower part of the brain is just activated constantly. That sort of survival part of the brain is being constantly activated by this threat detector. And when that happens, your ability to think and to plan gets sort of hijacked. So that the logical part of your brain is overwhelmed by that response that's happening lower down in the brain. And so our logical and language responses are unable to kick in, and they kind of are overwhelmed by those emotional and survival brain systems. And what happens is that this moves us, our bodies are designed to get us out of danger. And so when we have that threat detector go off, the smoke alarm goes off, our energy goes, what happens immediately and internally is that we move to this fight or flight or freeze place. So you've all heard of that. This part of the brain, this lower part of the brain, this threat response part is so sensitive to fear, stress, arousal, and it's just, on the edge of kind of reacting all the time. So what things might you see in a child when that's true, when they have this kind of threat response that's constantly being triggered and that's maybe below their level of awareness? So they don't even know what they're reacting to, they're just kind of reacting. So as we kind of scroll through this list, think about, do the kids that you work with, is this describing them, that they're vigilant, that they're anxious, edgy, tense, just highly reactive to situations they just can't manage in many different kinds of situations. Hyper alert. It's really interesting to me as we interview teams about children they're working with, and we ask about, are they kind of hyper alert? Are they scanning? Are they vigilant? And people will give examples of, oh yeah, this kid's got the greatest hearing. If there's anything going on in the house, they're wondering, what's that? Who's that? What's going on over there? Who's on the phone? Who are you talking to? They're looking for reassurance and needing information all the time. And so there's this kind of scanning that's happening with many of our kids. And that so you've got children that move quickly up to that fight or flight place. So we've got the kids that are crawling under desks or running to hide in their closet and cowering underneath a bunch of clothes in their closet, or crawling under their beds, the runaway kids, or even the running out the door and taking off. Then we've got the fight kids, the ones that are, ready to duke it out with you, and they're threatening you, and they're saying sometimes some terrible things to try and scare you away. So they're kind of huffing and puffing and, making themselves big and scary to try and get you to go away. Then we've got, what about just kind of this uncooperativeness that we see sometimes? So that sort of refusal. So we present something to a child that seems like a reasonable thing to do, but they just slam on the brakes. They're not willing to do it. They're not willing to try it, where they're just kind of overwhelmed with anxiety. It's not just that they're being oppositional, but they're overwhelmed with anxiety in that moment. And they wouldn't call it anxiety or experience it like that, but that stress response that they're having is like overwhelming them. Kids that have trouble with transitions. I bet a lot of you work with children where you have to prepare them long in advance for any kind of transition that's coming up. And if anything unexpected happens, you get a meltdown and a blow up. On the sort of the freeze side, you may have children that you work with where occasionally they seem to blank out, they space out, they become unresponsive. And these aren't the kids that pull their hoodies up over their head and stick their earbuds in and they're refusing to talk to you. These are kids where something's happening and they just go vacant. It's like they're not there. They've frozen. They've dissociated. They're unresponsive, not because they're trying to be unresponsive, but because they can't respond. Does that sound like kids that you work with? Kids that you care for? These would all be signs that this overreactive stress response is really challenging in them. So let's look at one example that we use to kind of describe this. So we use like this stress staircase that we developed out. We did this with Wanda Smith out of the MCFD Chilliwack office. And what we're trying to demonstrate is that idea that let's say we're going through a day, as we move up that stress staircase, and we're moving to that place of being alert and then being vigilant and then being stressed and then being kind of overwhelmed, that our stress sort of changes through the day. And we all have kind of a baseline place where we start, as we're going through the day. So for me today, I'm probably a little bit in the yellow zone because I'm excited about doing this, but I'm thinking, oh, there's 100 people that are going to be talking with this morning, and and I hope we get all the tech right and these other things. So there's a little bit of nervousness, but feeling good about it. But if you think about how different things happen during the day can move us up and down that stress staircase. One of the things that's so interesting for us is to think about the child that you know and that you care for, that you work with. Where are they on this? What's their baseline? And so many times we end up hearing about children where the team around them is saying, you know what? If there's 10 steps to this, they're running at step 8 all the time. That's their baseline spot. And it doesn't take much when you're at step 8 to have a little bit more stress added, a little bit more emotion added, a little bit more frustration added, and suddenly you're flooded. It's too much stimulation, too much frustration, too much emotion, too much threat, and you're flooded with that, and they move then into the fight or flight or freeze place. And so that idea of that stress staircase is just so important for us to understand our kids, but then also to think about what do we have to do to help them to be successful. So what we know is if we can help the child to be lower down on this stress staircase as their sort of baseline going through the day. So if we could move them from step 8 to step 6, what's this do? Well, it gives them a little bit more time to slow down, to think, to gain support, to calm themselves before they're in that flooded zone and before they move to the fight, flight, or freeze. And so every everything that we can do to help that child as baseline to be lower down on the scale, the better the day is going to go for them and for everybody around them that's caring for them. As you move up the stress staircase, you're moving down in the brain. So the thinking part of the brain is activated and online there as I'm calm and I'm engaged and I'm alert. That's the kind of green yellow zone is the best place for learning and creativity and all those kinds of things. But as we move up that scale, our focus gets narrow. We are really only worried about this particular thing that's right in front of us. Our thinking goes offline and we're just reacting from the lower parts of the brain, from the brainstem. And so let's see what we can do to kind of shift these kids a couple of notches down. Dr. Bruce Perry calls this resetting the thermostat. You can think about, we want to reset that smoke alarm detector a little bit. Is another way to think about it. So as we were talking about this today, I frame this as coming at this in 3 ways. So stress is the enemy because it pushes our kids up this stress staircase, and our kids their brains are primed to be higher up on the stress staircase. They're not choosing to be there. So we want to come at this in 3 ways. I like to think about coming at it outside in. What can we do from the environment and the situations they're in? From bottom up within their bodies, and then sort of top down. What can we do to teach them some things that would help them to take over and to provide calming? So let's think about that then. It's outside in, bottom up, and top down. So the bottom up ones are more sort of sensory body based, as I said, and then top down more active. Okay, so so we work really hard in the cases that we're involved with to think about how do we decrease stress on this child in terms of their regular routine, their daily life, the things that are happening to them during the week. How can we reduce those situations where they're being triggered and not having success? So what can we do to just take those things off the table at the moment, slow them down, take 2 steps backwards so that we can help the child to calm so we can take 3 steps forward in a more successful way. So we're looking at those things in the child's life and schedule that we can decrease. What kinds of things do you think of when you think about that? What are those situations that are stressful for kids? When I think about kids who don't manage their emotions, who feel like failures, who can't manage their behavior very well, school is often a big stressor. What can we do around school to make that a more successful place rather than sort of continue to push the child towards a school environment where they're not being successful? Can we back away from that and then move back towards that in a different way? What about for kids in foster care? I think about family visits. Heartaches for these kids that are disconnected from their family. And yet oftentimes those visits, the parents have their own struggles and the parents aren't able to make sure they're going to show up for their appointments or in the appointments to pay attention to the child, to pay attention to the child in a positive way that builds attachment. And so sometimes those very visits that we're trying to encourage with the parents are actually creating more injury around attachment and very stressful for kids. I'm thinking about a couple of other situations. Just back to the school example, we worked with a little boy. This boy was adopted and he was 6 and he was in grade 1. And what we noticed is going to school in the morning, the adoptive parent would take him in by hand into the school. And what we saw is that he would begin to shut down. So he'd stop talking, he'd put his head down, he'd stop being responsive as they're walking down the hall. And if she wasn't holding, he would actually stop and freeze at some points and not move. And he would turn towards the wall and he would start banging his head against the wall. So this boy's experience of walking to school, for whatever reasons, he was too stressed in that situation. He was starting to dissociate, to freeze, to hurt himself. And once we realized that that was a stress response, then we were able to build in things that would help him to cope with that in a better way. And we were able to move forward with that. And he's done really well. But to recognize that initially that was too much stress for this little guy. So where in the week can we decrease that stress? I think about, when the kids struggle in all those different areas that we saw in our developmental domains, often we end up bringing in a whole lot of different professionals. So they get an appointment with the OT and they've got a speech and language person and they've got a mental health person and their week is actually full of these shifts and transitions and appointments that make their life busy and stressful. So sometimes we back off a lot of those and then sort of move forward later. What can we do to decrease those kind of erratic, unpredictable kind of events, right? How can we take some of those out of the schedule? And on the positive side, predictability, routine, these things help our kids immensely. So the more predictable and routine, they know what's going to happen, the better they're going to do. And if we can make that into a bit of a ritual, if we add that warm connection as part of each one of those transitions um, and routines through the week, then we're decreasing that stress arousal. So all of that's that sort of outside in piece, right? And I'm sure you're working hard to help your kids ahead of time with this. Okay, bottom up interventions. So Dr. Perry talks about a pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stimulation, that this is calming and organizing to the brain. So this is something we keep in mind when we think about things we're doing with kids. Is there a way to make what we're doing pattern, repetitive, and rhythmic? Because that will help them. One of the things in this area about the sort of bottom up is that it's preventive. Think about our stress staircase. So we don't want to wait till the child's up on stair 9 and then give them something calming to do. What we want to do is to build into our day regular, planned, calming times when you can feel the tension go out of their body, where you can feel, it's like you get that big sigh of, and one foster parent was telling me one way she did this is wrapped a warm blanket around her little guy. I think she had an 8-year-old, and she'd throw the blanket in the dryer, warm it up for a minute, wrap it around him. And she said, when I did that, I could feel him just relax and exhale, and all that tension that he carried in his shoulders and arms, he would just kind of melt into it. And so we're really thinking about what can we do on a sensory level throughout the day on a planned basis, use those sensory experiences to bring that calming. We had one foster parent. We're not going to have anywhere near enough time today, are we? We have one foster parent with a little guy who was super, super dysregulated. And when we talked about things that calmed him down, she talked about how much he loved water. And it happened that this particular foster parent lived near a hot springs up in the interior of BC. And so she started taking him to the hot springs. And she would float around in that, in the hot pool, and he'd be on his back and she'd be, holding him like this. And she said, as she did that, she said she could just, again, feel the tension go out of his body. They were sort of face to face, just walking around as she's talking in his ear, and he was building trust in her that she was holding him. He was relaxing. It became this beautiful experience. What we're trying to do is to move these kids from step 8 down to step 6 or step 5 through any kinds of interventions like this. So there's lots of ways to get at this. We can use touch to do that. We can use music, sound to do that. We can use movement. And even sense. There are different scents that kids might find to be really soothing to them. And so we're really wanting to be a little bit like detectives with each of the children, is to ask them to experiment, try different things. What do they like? What do they not like? What things seem to be calming to them? What things don't? So there's lots of examples that we could give around touch, but human touch can be very calming. And so we're looking for this to be invited by the child, but it's those hugs that they need. One of my kids struggled with anxiety, and when I would go up from the front and give him this big hug from the front and squeeze, again, I could just feel him melt into that. And I could feel that the anxious thoughts he can then be on top of and not be so bothered by them. We're looking for ways, even with kids for whom touch has been problematic, we're looking for ways to kind of build that in. Brushing a child's hair, rubbing lotion on their skin, on their hands, and extending that time. So we're giving them some touch, and it's soothing. We'll do that in a way that can really help to calm them. We have to kind of race through a couple of these things. One concept I like, I'll come back to this maybe later, but the idea of move, work, breathe. And so as part of a kind of a routine that we could do with a child throughout the day is we could take these 5 minutes or 10 minutes and we could think about move, first, then work, then breathe. So the movement might be doing jumping jacks together. Okay, we're going to do 10 jumping jacks. Oh, everybody does that, and we do it together. So we're building relationship, and we do 10 jumping jacks to the point where we're out of breath. Now we stop. Oh, we take a couple of deep breaths. Ah, we're calming ourselves down. Okay, and then the work part is a tension release thing, or lifting something heavy, and or tension. We tense, 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 release, and then shake it all out, and tense, 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 release. And then the breathing part could be a structured breathing exercise. One of our colleagues uses that kind of 5-finger breathing, and she talks about, all right, you breathe in and out, and in and out, and you just go through that. And that combination of the movement, then with a couple of breaths in between, and then the work, that tension release or hard work, and then the breathing, that sequence is something that seems to really help kids to reset. I'm looking at the time here and don't want to kind of overrun this part, but around sound, all kinds of different examples. Kids will tell you what sounds they like. We've had homes with really dysregulated little kids where they're playing sort of symphony music throughout the day, just kind of calming. We're looking for something that's got that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic kind of feel to it. So sometimes the music that the kids are choosing isn't the best, because we want to make sure it's got that consistent beat to it. And Dr. Perry talks about that being kind of 60 to 80 beats a minute. That's kind of what we want them to be hearing. And we might use sound to just to block out other noise, particularly at night, so they're not hearing other things that could be stressful to them. Think about a child who's in a trying to learn. They're in a academic setting, and they're very conscious of all of the, because they're on high alert, they're very conscious of all those other sounds in the classroom, in the hallway, out in the parking lot. And so that's where the noise canceling headphones or something else that could kind of take those distractions away, the distractions that are actually causing a fear response. So it's partly the distraction, it's partly that these things are provoking a fear response. So is there a way that we can break that? Here's some examples of movement and breathing. So we don't need to be, we have to be careful with a lot of our kids with the trauma histories, because lots of movement, excessive movement, actually for many of them ends up with them getting into that hyper aroused state. You have to experiment again with your particular child. I like the tension release kinds of things. The chair idea is just to squeeze into your chair, pull down into your chair as hard as you can and count to 10. And then you get to 10 and you shake it all out. Or going and pushing the wall. And again, hopefully doing this together, but that's a sort of tension and then release and then breathing. Stretching is another way to get that kind of work component in there, where it's a stretch and it's hard, and then we're back and then we breathe. In all of this, again, with movement, we're thinking of pattern, repetitive, and rhythmic. So general recreation activities where a child's out playing basketball and running around, that's great for different things and for relational connection and other things. It's not necessarily calming in that same way, because it doesn't have that pattern, repetitive, rhythmic part. About the dribbling the ball might, but so often we're shooting the ball, it's hitting the hoop and it's running over there, and then we're running after it, and it doesn't have that sort of same feel of pattern, repetitive, and rhythmic that you might have, let's say, with a lap swimming or running or jogging or being on a bicycle, which has more of that built in. And bilateral movement would be really, really helpful. That's like that, because it actually is calming and integrating to the brain, both things. So it's calming, but it's also kind of helps the brain to integrate when we have that bilateral movement as part of what we're planning to do with kids. All right, I'm just going to sort of wrap up this piece around sense. It's pretty obvious probably around that. I wanted to just touch on sleep for a moment. So many of our kids struggle with sleep, and so they might struggle getting to sleep. They might struggle staying asleep. They might struggle with looking like they're conked out, but actually never getting to a deep sleep, because throughout the night they're triggering that amygdala is alerting them that there's something that happened that they might have to be afraid of. A door closed in the house, a car drove by, and so what we've I like to think about the night hours as being a bit of a captive audience for us. And it's amazing how much when we've introduced some sort of patterned, repetitive, rhythmic sound at night, how many of our kids responded really well to that. I'm thinking of a little boy. Little boy was adopted. He and his sister were adopted, and in that home, the parents were saying he never sleeps more than maybe an hour, hour and a half at a time, and then he's up. And so, and he never sleeps if he's away from us. He has to be in the room with us, in the bed with us, and he's waking up, every 90 minutes or 60 to 90 minutes, and he's awake and he wants attention and he can't get back to sleep. And just, they were so exhausted. And we talked with them about this idea of this pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stimulation. And with this particular boy, we knew that in utero, life was really tough for his mom. There was abuse, there was malnutrition, there was substance abuse. And so we were imagining that he hadn't, heard that steady maternal heartbeat that would have been so regulating to him and to his brain. And so what we've done with that little boy is we got him a teddy bear that had a heartbeat in it, because we wanted to give him that thing that he'd missed in his development. So parents got this, they tried this, we talked to them about 3 days later, and they said, "You won't believe it, he's sleeping through the night." Unbelievable, right away. And we've seen that same response with older kids, with teens, where if we're able to introduce something there to help them to sleep deeper and to provide that pattern, rhythmic, repetitive stimulation, we've often seen dramatic changes in how they're able to handle emotion and stress through the day. So all of these things are resetting that child's, their thermostat, that smoke alarm detector. We're resetting it a little bit further down that stress staircase. Two particular things I'll just mention here. The Dream Pad pillow is one where the pillow actually has some things built into it that provides music and also a little bit of vibration that helps children to sleep. And another thing we found is one of our team members loves dogs, and she found that for puppies, they have these heartbeat puppies that you can get, a little teddy that looks like a dog, and they actually built those for puppies to take with them when they're separated from their mother for the first time. And we found that our kids love those often because they're so cute and cuddly. And so heartbeat puppies is another one. So we talked about outside in, managing stress outside in, bottom up. And then we're also going to want to do that top down. How do we teach children some self-calming activities? How can we help them to find the things that are helpful to them to calm? And then we want to, once they've learned some of those things, we want to practice them with them when things are going well. And then the first times they start to use those, when they're stressed and they go and get their calming tools box and they use one of those skills, then we're going to reward the heck out of that, because that's just such an important thing that they're doing. So yeah, I don't think I spend a whole lot of time on this. I think the whole idea of teaching kids skills, I bet a lot of you have ideas about how to teach them to do that calming, but I think we have to do that initial level of calming kind of outside in, bottom up, often before the kids will start to be able to take it on for themselves. Yeah, so I'm just wanting to be kind of aware of the time here. So just finish up with this. How do we help a child who's not calm? Number one, take a breath. Calm yourself. If you're stressed out because they're getting stressed out, they're going to pick up on those cues and you're both off to the races, heading up that stress staircase. Remember that the child doesn't like this either. They don't like this feeling of being out of control. They don't like this feeling of not being able to manage things. So just have some sympathy for them at that moment, and realize they're not doing this, even though it might look like they're doing this to sort of demand and get their way, and it's coming out as big and angry, that the child doesn't like this either. It's a coping skill they've learned, but it's not something that makes them feel good. We want to provide empathy. We want to notice their feelings, acknowledge their feelings, and validate their feelings. That'll often let that sort of stress out of that. Think about a balloon that's puffing up. The child's stressed. And if we just not acknowledge their feelings and validate their feelings, oftentimes it's like letting the air out of the balloon. It really helps to calm them down. And then encourage the use of the strategies, obviously, when they're able to do that. Again, practicing when they're calm so that they're more likely to do that when they're not. One of the things I like is the idea of using distraction in the moment to something sensory. So kids kind of, I find that when they get in that agitated state, that they're focused on one thing and they're locked into this one thing. And it's almost like they're sort of stuck cognitively and physiologically in this rut. I think about, I'm a little bit old, so we used to listen to records, and there's, it would get, as the record was turning, the needle would get stuck sometimes and keep bouncing in that, in the rut. And it's almost like you had to bump it out of there to get, to be able to get them to shift. And so distraction is really valuable. And I think a distraction to sensory things can be helpful. So even when they're sort of going on with something, whoa, what's that? Can you hear that? That sounds like a siren. Is that a siren? I wonder what's going on. I'm trying to distract them to use a sensory experience that actually would take them away from that sort of agitation and emotional and kind of locked in thinking that they get into. So that might be a sound, it might be a touch. Oh man, I just noticed it's cold in here. I can feel goosebumps on my hand. Do you have goosebumps on your arm? I'm sure feeling it. We're trying to distract them into that sensory experience that would actually help them to move away from the other. All right, I'm going to wrap up there, and we're going to take a look at some questions that folks have sent in. Okay, so here's a question. I have a child who's been diagnosed with FASD. They're adopted from another country at 15 months of age. So lots of stress in this child's life, right? So with adoption, moving to another country, you think about how they even got into a place where there needed to be adoption to begin with. Always seeking sugar. Yeah, now 13 years old, they'll sneak out in the middle of the night to find it, even go out to the garage and look through the car in the garage. Okay. Yeah, so interesting question. Okay, so a couple different parts of this. So the sugar seeking is definitely something that we've seen a lot with kids with that early developmental trauma, particularly when there's in utero issues. And I think one of the, so we get kids who are like seeking the sugar, but we also get kids where they're focused on food, and maybe for slightly different reasons. So the sugar craving, it seems like that's something that goes along with that kind of some of the physiological challenges with early in utero trauma. And you think about, maybe one explanation for this, you think about a parent who's abusing alcohol while pregnant. That what is that? What is alcohol? Well, it's a wash of sugar into the mother's system repeatedly over and over and over, which goes through the barrier into the baby as well, right? So it may be that there's something to do with that sort of history of kind of high sugar, and that's part of why the craving is. I'm just speculating a little bit about that, but it would make sense that there's some connection there for me. But let's think about just to kind of broaden this a little bit around food security, and also some other things that can cause that kind of craving. So let me talk about the craving part. So one other situation that we see is that many of the kids because their behavior is so challenging, many of them end up on different types of medication, including antipsychotics at times. So this would be risperidol, Seroquel, also known as quetiapine, Abilify, and all of these medications are being used as sort of as sedatives to try and quiet that, or to try and cause the child to not react as much and not explode so much. But each one of them has a really high risk that it drives their physiology towards craving carbs, craving sugars. And so with many children, we've got that push to insatiable kind of appetites, and particularly for carbs. And it's driven by those medications. If you've got kids on those medications, we're looking for other ways to try and deal with the problems rather than using those medications. around the food security issues, many of our kids haven't had food when they've needed it. So if you think about if you're a baby and you're hungry, you're crying because you're hungry and nobody comes to feed you. Nobody comes to satisfy that need. Maybe a little bit later in life, you're hungry and there's no food in the house and you look around and there's no food on the table. There's no food in the cupboards. You don't know where your mom is. So there could be a lot of insecurity around foods that come out of a kid's experience. One of the things that we've worked at is to think about how can we provide food for them. So I know, we've worked with a number of families where, they felt like they had to lock everything up. And so the kitchen's kind of locked down and they're trying to protect the food like that because the child will not only get into it, but will eat nonstop and can't regulate that at all. And so one of the things that we've done is we've actually worked with them about making some food available all the time for the child in their room. So you're picking things that are a little bit healthier. So you might have some granola bars, something else like that, something that's not going to make a big mess, but the child has these available to them all the time. So they don't have to worry, don't have that fear response, stress response being stimulated when they think they can't get food. So we're trying to sort of provide that as much as possible. One other thing about the FASD diagnosis. So FASD absolutely exists. So the alcohol during pregnancy can harm the baby for sure. I think in what we also know at the same time is that complex trauma, so issues with attachment, issues with the mother being under stress during pregnancy, maternal depression where they're not able to respond to the kids, living in situations where there's domestic violence, having abuse directed at you, all those things can create behavior and emotions and abilities in the kids that looks exactly like FASD. I think in our system in BC, because one of the easiest places to get an assessment is through the complex developmental behavior conditions kind of approach, which would be in the interior, it's ICANN, or here in the Valley, FHAN, I think is the name of it, or at Sunny Hill Hospital. But the intent is to try and go to these places to get an assessment about the issues the kids are facing. Because we've got a list of symptoms or a list of problems that looks exactly the same between FASD, or very similar between FASD and complex trauma, sometimes though in those clinics, the explanation is to go more towards the fact that the parent was drinking. And then we get the FASD diagnosis, which again may be absolutely true in certain circumstances. But sometimes I wonder if we're missing the complex trauma point of it. We're not recognizing that, yeah, mom was drinking, but she was also physically abused. She was also unsafe. She was also couch surfing. She had all of these other stressors and was not responsive to the baby, able to respond to the baby once the baby was born. All of those things have just as much weight as the alcohol, perhaps. And in fact, we've got kids that look like they've got FASD and there's no history of mom drinking. It's because of all of these other kinds of stresses. So I'm always a little bit cautious about the FASD diagnoses. I know how you get there, but I'm always a bit cautious about that. And one of the reasons is sort of the explanation for it, even the way it makes us think about the child. So sometimes when we get this FASD diagnosis, the old definition of it used to have the term static brain encephalopathy, fixed brain damage, as if the child likely wouldn't grow and develop. And sometimes adding that label, the FASD label, sometimes that pushes us to a place of feeling a little more hopeless and feeling like, oh, well, we're just managing this. The child's not going to get better. But what brain science tells us is if there's any time when a child can grow and develop, it's during childhood. And if we give the right kinds of experiences, the brain is remarkable in its ability to restore and recover and heal. And so I like thinking from the complex trauma perspective because it's hopeful. If our goal is to increase the child's development across these different domains, then we ought to see growth and development. And in fact, we've worked with 300 children across the province, children and teens, and we see growth across every, like significant growth across every one of those 7 developmental domains, to the point that many of the kids that are diagnosed with FASD or autism or something else early on, they don't actually meet the criteria for that after we've worked through our CCI processes and so our healing processes for them. And so it just makes me a bit skeptical about the FASD diagnosis and wanting to see if there's another explanation that doesn't maybe box us in quite so much. Yeah, we'd see if there went a bunch of different directions from that question. Can we give some examples of what regulation interventions were implemented in the example of the child who had hit his head against the wall? Okay, yeah, so this particular boy, so I think what we felt like is he was being rushed into a situation in the school, so heading into class when it was noisy, when it was busy, and he just was on a sensory level was being overwhelmed. And so one of the first things we did is, this is actually the same boy we used the sleep, we used that heartbeat teddy bear. And so he was sleeping better, so he was in a better regulated state. Really great adoptive parent would bring him to the school in the morning, but they would come late. They'd wait until all the kids were in the classroom, the halls were quiet, they would go in then, and then we also took him then, for his first stop was the principal's office, had a really good relationship with the principal. And so the handoff from mom to the school happened in the principal's office, and they would just sit there and be together for a number of minutes. And then when the boy was ready, which so it might be a few minutes, 5 minutes, then the principal would take his hand and they would go down the hall together into the classroom. So at that point, we're removing a lot of that stimulation, the busyness of the hallways, and then making sure he had this kind of relational connection to take him all the way through, and then a handoff to the EA in the classroom. And what we found is that we're doing other things as well, but in terms of that specific thing, that was able to enabled him to be able to stay calm enough and secure enough that he wasn't freezing and he wasn't doing the head banging. I'll probably generate some more questions. I have a question about teens with autism who have school trauma after years of ongoing bullying. How do you reach them when they are totally resisting connection, maybe due to lack of trust? Wow. Yeah, I really feel for kids who are maybe have an autism diagnosis, but then have had these experiences where they feel like they're a round peg in a square hole. They don't understand what's happening. They feel they're being bullied, or experience that they're being bullied, may feel like academically they're not succeeding. And it's not just kids with autism like that. That would be any kind of child. One thing that I'm convinced about is that regardless of these diagnoses, that this stress reduction, that stress is the enemy underneath every one of these. So how do we help that child's stress response to be calmer? And how do we build those strong relational connections that give them a sense of trust and safety in the world? If we're doing those two things at once, it'll be helpful for them. So with the situation where kids have been, school has been a place where they've felt hurt, where they felt unsuccessful, they felt stupid maybe, they felt mocked or bullied. Let's start with decreasing that stress response. It seems kind of silly, but that's always where we'd start. If we can help these kids to be able to self-regulate, then as that fear starts to rise, as they start to have a reaction about something that they're seeing, then we've got an ability to sort of step in there and provide the support they need to stay in a calmer place and to move forward and be successful. So regardless of diagnosis. With a lot of kids where they've had failures, what they would feel like were failures academically, I really like the idea of sort of backing away and thinking about, it's not about academics at that point, it's about how do we make this child feel that they can learn and that learning's fun? What do we have to do that? And sometimes that's going to be, think about how do we bring a tutor in, or even encourage the caregivers just to follow the child's interests and to build learning activities around what they're already interested and good at. How can we build so that they're beginning to learn and experience that learning is fun, completely separate from kind of formal academics in the school setting. And then we try and take that
that learning is fun and I can learn feeling into that new situation. Related to the bullying, I wonder if there's ways to buddy kids up. Um, if you've got somebody looking out for you at the school, someone that another student that's looking out for you, that's an older mentor that's going to that feeling that they could protect you, that they're that might help to decrease that stress as well. With autism and kids that have trouble reading the social cues with others, there could be you probably want to do a lot of practice around some of those skills. So yeah, tough situation, but I think it'd be sort of have to be multifaceted approach there. Okay, we've got a question about Mind Up. Take a quick read of this, and then we'll need to sort of move ahead. So talking about Mind Up, which are a good curriculum, we like it a lot. Okay, I'm not sure if you're seeing this or not. So a question about Mind Up and celebrating stress, in a sense that stress is kind of a protective thing, and that our bodies learn to manage stress. Yeah, there's probably an interesting question about how we view stress, right? So on the one hand, manageable stress is helpful. Manageable stress builds our capacity, builds our sense of success. Overwhelming stress is not. So maybe there's a way to differentiate that. So there's good stress and bad stress in a sense, right? There's a good stress comes from a challenge that we can, with support, overcome and build confidence in, and bad stress is when it immobilizes us and makes us too fearful. We don't know how to move forward. Maybe that's one distinction that you could build in there as you're thinking about the students you work with. Okay, well, our time's just about up. I really hope that this was somehow helpful to you today. But I want to share one more thing with you and just sort of talk about some resources that are available on our website, so Complex Trauma Resources website. So let me find this for you and share this. Okay, so complextrauma.ca. Numbers of you have probably seen this before. We want to point out a couple of things in particular. So one thing is that we've just launched 3 different courses that are available online for groups or individuals to do. And if I scroll down here, we'll see new online trauma-focused courses available, and they're listed here. So trauma-focused residential caregiving course. So for people who are working in staffed homes, this is also a really good kind of primer for our CCI model, our complex trauma intervention model. Trauma-focused schools, and giving and receiving healing. This is giving and receiving healing is a course particularly for caregivers, foster parents, family caregivers caring for someone else's child. There's lots of relevance here for adoptive parents, biological parents as well, but it's geared particularly for foster parents and caregivers of other people's children, so maybe even a family member's child. So 3 courses we're very excited about. There's links here that you can follow. And as part of this, since you joined the webinar today, we're happy to share a discount code with you for those. So all of those courses, if you type in the discount code of webinar20, webinar20, we'll give you a 20% discount on those. Under resources here, so we wanted to show you that under the resources tab, if you go to resources by topic, what you're able to do is to search for a particular topic area that you're interested in. So for example, here, if we scroll down, let's say rich in ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So what we could do is to click on the ACEs button, and what you'll find is articles, videos, other websites, things that we found that we think would be particularly helpful for you to understand ACEs. Most of what we have pulled together is available for you free. If you there are other ones that you would need to become members of Complex Trauma Resources in order to access them, but lots of resources there. We also have, at this point, probably 60 or 70 blog posts by our clinical team on all kinds of different topics. Let's see if that's going to pull up for me. Yeah. So for instance, one by me on what's all the fuss about complex trauma. We've got some COVID self-care, how to manage stress blog posts and videos. We've got, yeah, all kinds of different topics, schools, caregivers, helping younger children, helping older children, all done by our complex trauma resources team. And we also wanted to let you know about something called a healing tool. So we know that oftentimes you're looking for practical ideas. Well, what can I use? What's something I can get that would help my child? So we talked about a couple of them, for instance, around the around sleep. So I can go to the particular problem that my child's struggling with. And I mentioned these things earlier. I talked about a dream pad pillow. So this is something that, yeah, it's got that combination of an MP3 player in it. So there's quiet music that's being played for the child. You can put in something that's patterned, repetitive, and rhythmic. And it's also got some stimulation there, a little bit of vibration that stimulates them. What they say is it stimulates the bones in the back of the head, which helps you to get a deeper sleep. And we've got our puppy, heartbeat puppy down here as well. So these are all just kind of examples. There's books, there's all kinds of other resources that you can find here. And we've tried to find out where to get these things, because that's the next question is, where can I get a heartbeat puppy or something like that? So these are all listed, and we list them under the particular type of challenge that you're having with your child. All right. Well, we are out of time. I'm so pleased that you joined us. And I hope that there's something in here that was helpful for you, something that you'd be able to apply directly with the child that you care for, that you work with. We know it's a hard job, and any way we can support you in that, we would love to do that. Check out our website, all kinds of information and resources on our website if you haven't been on there. And yeah, again, thanks so much. We will likely do this again every second month, so you can watch for that in your email.